Welcome back to the Anti-Meta Club. Last week we really had our work cut out for us trying to figure out what car could beat the GT, but this week it's kind of nice, a lot of different cars work. Some people are saying the meta is the Supra. Some people are saying it's the Ferrari. The SLS is the meta when it comes to the time trial, and it's really good in the race as well, so honestly, a lot of different cars work. So let's get into it. Firstly, I'm not actually convinced there is a meta car this week. The Ferrari is used by a lot of people, but also there are a lot of people who don't necessarily have good pace, who are ending up with really good pace in the race with the Ferrari, so I think there's a lot more to it. With that said, I just chose the Jag because it's definitely not the top car, but it's a really good one. The SLS appears to be the meta when it comes to time trialing, however, a lot of different cars are pretty good. The 458 does seem to be the meta car when it comes to race pace, but a lot of different cars do work, like I keep saying. So with that, I just chose the Jag because it's one of my favorite fuel-saving cars. T1 at Autopolis can be very tricky, so be extremely patient with yourself if you're just learning it now. We're going to use a few different braking references for this corner. After the 100-meter board, you're going to see this orange part of the wall, and it's going to be after that, but before the dark mark on the track ahead. Downshift quickly, so by the time you get to the 50-meter board, you're in third gear and start trail braking in. Downshift to second to make sure you tuck the nose in and get all the way up on this curb here, then back to third and gently on the throttle. If you're sliding at all and you hit this outside curb, you're likely to spin and it's going to be unrecoverable. Conveniently, there are some nice tire marks that kind of guide you to this next apex, even though it's just barely a kink. The orange part of the barrier on the left opens up to a little access road, and when you get all the way past that, but before the 50-meter board, you're going to hit the brakes. Turn in before you get to the outside curbing in fourth gear, and then down to third gear to help with understeer as you hit this first apex on the inside curb. While at full throttle, continue steering until you get between these two curbs right here. Turn in, lift, then dab the brakes after the weight has transferred. Turn in more, then use as much throttle as you can while not missing this inside curb, but enough that you don't go over the grass. You want to carry as much speed through here as you possibly can. Continue turning as you stay on the throttle, and then right before the end of the curb on the right, straighten out, downshift, turn in, get to first, trail brake, and try to double apex this tight little hairpin. You want to be in second gear before you get on the throttle, and if you're understeering, a little bit of a blip of the throttle can get the rear end to rotate. Don't slide, just rotate if need be, making sure you keep as much grip on exit as you can. Driving up onto this outside curbing here, we're going to follow the tire marks as we turn in, then lift, and then continue turning in as the car decelerates. When we see that shack that's in the distance, we're going to start using the throttle, gently of course, but continue steering towards the inside to make sure that you don't go all the way off as you exit this corner. This one's really tricky, and it's going to take some practice to make sure that you hit the apex and you're patient enough on the throttle that you don't just hit it early and then go off all the way into the grass. We're going pretty steeply uphill, so our brakes are going to be a little bit more affected than we might expect. So wait till you get to the 50-meter mark here on the outside. I like to quickly get down to third gear and then turn in before we get to this outside curbing here on the right. Full brake in second gear, then trail brake as we downshift to first gear, back up to second, continue turning, and then gently on the throttle, being careful not to slide too much because if you do, you're going to lose a lot of momentum. Make sure you just rotate and then stay fully in second gear as we exit. Gently get yourself to the left side of the track, and after this 100-meter board, we're going to look for the 50-meter board. We want to brake in time that we can be trail braking and turning in by the time we get to it. Trail brake in towards the apex, and don't be afraid to come entirely off the brakes to add a little bit more steering to get the car to rotate just a little bit. Get back on the throttle when you're certain that you can go all the way up onto this curb without going over, and then turn in before you get to the end of it. What you're going to want to do is downshift to third and hit this clipping point right about when you get to this orange mark here on the barrier. Use the throttle to balance the car and make sure that you don't go too high up on that curb and into the grass. Continue turning, and then at this other orange mark, that's when we're going to switch the direction of the car. Staying on the throttle to keep up the speed, you want to modulate it to make sure, again, you're keeping up as much speed as you can while going all the way up on that curb, and right before you get to this curbing here, we're going to apply the brakes, downshift to second for rotation, and then back up to third before we hit this next apex. You'll notice I was a little bit on the throttle even when I was in second gear, but we want to be in third as early as possible so the car stays really stable through this next section. Stay full throttle, but don't use too much of that inside curving, it will make you slide. As you turn in, lift off the throttle to get it to tuck in, then back on the throttle and modulate it, again just trying to keep as much momentum as we possibly can while lifting off the throttle however much is needed to make sure that we're hitting all of these clipping points. It's more important to carry speed all the way to the outside there than it is to set yourself all the way up on the left here. Before you get to the curbing on the left, we're going to change directions with the car, then start to decelerate, downshifting to third, looking for the second orange marker on the inside, and just barely brushing the brakes to scrub off enough speed so you can hit the inside clipping point. The track's at an incline until right about when you get to the orange mark, and then it becomes a decline, so that's when you want to wait to get on the throttle. Using the curb can help you rotate, but it can also make you slide, and you just want to go straight over this inside curb, not worrying too much about what it'll do because you don't have to turn the wheel too much, so the effects on the car's balance won't matter too much unless you go way over it and slide off, and we want to avoid that, of course. Like I mentioned in the breakdown, the braking point here is more like a series of references to position your car rather than a really concrete spot to hit the brakes. Using this view, you might actually be blind on where you want to turn in, but make sure that you turn in earlier than you think, hit that apex, and just try to skate off of it without sliding the car. Keeping up your momentum is really important for that corner. For any of the switchback consecutive corners on this track, it's really important to be very gentle and smooth as you're switching directions. It's kind of an illusion when you see people switching back and forth really quickly. What you're really seeing is them carrying a lot of speed, and as they switch directions, it looks like the actual switch is really quick, but it's anything except abrupt. In fact, if you switch directions too quickly and transfer too much weight, it's actually going to take more weight off of the inside tires than it's going to give to the outside tires. What I mean to say is, if you think that transferring weight super heavy onto one side will help the outside tires grip, it's actually going to take so much off the inside tires that your overall grip is going to be less than if you're just really gentle when you switch directions. It's also really important to learn the difference between rotation and sliding. I was able to get the car to rotate on the really tight corners by getting on the throttle a little bit sharper than I usually would, but the goal is to make sure that the car doesn't continue sliding and it only slides just enough to get the car to rotate and then back on the power to get it to grip. Watch every time that I switch directions that it's smooth from left to right, or I'm making adjustments to make sure that the car doesn't slide as I transfer the weight. It's really important to do this as gentle as possible. I can't stress that enough. When you switch back and forth way too quickly, you're going to find yourself losing momentum even if you don't slide. Finally, on this final corner, you're going to be really tempted to go wide, but it's just going to waste a lot of time. Make sure you stay really close to the apex and get on the throttle as early as you can, and you should be totally fine. 2 weeks ago, we had a Group 4 fuel saving race, but you had to save a lot more fuel than you had for this race. And on top of that, this race is exactly 10 laps long, which means that you just have to memorize that you need only 10% fuel per lap to make it to the end. Mediums are available, but hards are actually required, which means that the very best strategy you can do is start and finish on hards, don't even think about going into the pits, and just save enough fuel as you go through the race to make sure you don't have to refuel. I say this every time, but the fuel map that I'm actually using on screen right now is the least effective way to save fuel during a race. The very best way to do it is by short shifting, or short shifting with a combination of using the fuel map when you're in slipstream or lifting and coasting. For the absolute simplest way to think about it, just choose about 75% of the digital tachometer to start shifting at, and make sure that you shift there every single time you get it, rather than at the end of the car's rev range. When you get really used to that, however, you can play around with it a lot more. What I do usually is use a little bit more fuel at the beginning to make sure I stay with the pack, and then as I get really close to a car in front of me and I can use their slipstream, I can start shifting earlier and earlier, making sure I'm in the highest gear possible while staying close to the car in front. For really extreme fuel saving, as I get really close to the car's bumper in front, then I can switch the fuel map up to a more lean setting, but it's really not necessary in this race here. As I saw Womble Leader stay really close to the inside, I was actually going to go for a pass there, but I underestimated how slippery the super cold front tires were going to be and almost went off. So that was actually just a big mistake on my part. You'll notice that it says I have 11.6 remaining laps of fuel and 96% fuel remaining in the tank, and what you really want to pay attention to is just the fuel remaining. The remaining laps is an estimate based on how much of the race you have left, how much of the race you've done, and how much average fuel you've used in the laps that you've already completed. It's much more reliable to just decide instead how much fuel you can use safely per lap and then go from there. It's obviously going to take a lot of experience, like I keep saying, but you're going to use more fuel on your first lap than on your last lap. And it's going to be for a couple reasons. One, you're going to notice that you start at 99% fuel instead of 100% fuel, and as the car actually depletes weight because of using the fuel, it'll become more efficient with the remaining fuel. One of the harder things that you're going to have to think about during races like this is when to pass people versus when to just save your fuel. A common theme that I think about and I talk about a lot in these videos is knowing the people that you race against. Unfortunately, I only knew Womble leader, and since we were already past him, it wasn't going to help too much when it came to deciding who I would try to pass versus who I would try to stay behind. If I knew, for instance, that Zape was going to be as fast as me, I might spend some time just trying to stick to his bumper and use even less fuel than I usually would, so I can have longer towards the end of the race using more fuel, using any kind of surplus that I can to go full bore and full throttle and full revs. Since I didn't know any of these guys, I had to make sure that I was just trying to pay attention to what I see, and so when you look at people making desperate defense moves, you can usually tell they're probably not going to be that fast pace-wise. Another interesting thing to pay attention to is the fact that medium tires are available, so some people who aren't quite as savvy as you when it comes to these strategies might be using mediums and have to pit. Some, furthermore, might be using mediums and not know they have to pit and will then end up with a 1-minute penalty at the end, but of course you're just going to have to try to use your powers of deduction to figure out who's doing what. One thing you may have noticed is that this Eggy guy in front of us did not pay attention or did not care about the fact that my nose was peeking in a little bit. There was a little bit overlap before that last hairpin. Now, I'm not saying he should have given me that position, but most people who are trying to be at least a little bit more cautious or a little bit more aware would probably not turn in pretending I wasn't there. They'd probably give me at least a little bit more space, because there is a difference between taking the space and pretending like a car isn't there, and he either didn't know or he was just pretending I wasn't there. He was definitely paying attention now, considering the fact that he kind of just mirrored my position. He went halfway towards the other side of the track instead of all the way taking the racing line, and then when I went all the way taking the racing line, he then was comfortable enough to go back. But here, I'm not sure if he just turned into me or if he lost control of the car, but he was all the way off the curb. It looked like he just wanted to turn in early and was ignoring the fact that I was there once again. This is a pretty common thing when it comes to people who are fairly new to this. They'll turn in even if you're there because they're just out of ideas and they just assume that you're going to lift off, despite the fact that you're completely next to him. But either way, I'm glad he didn't go all the way off the track, but that was not the only incident he was part of, so hopefully he'll learn from this. Because of all that battling done with that last guy, it took almost a full lap to get to a position where I could then try to make another move. It's really important that you stay disciplined when it comes to fuel usage when you're in these situations and you're trying to catch up to people ahead, because if you use too much fuel to catch up to people ahead, then you're not going to have enough fuel to make a move or to even finish the race. You may find if you stay really disciplined with your fuel that you're going to have a big surplus, and then if you put enough pressure on people, you might cause them to use even more fuel than they would usually use, and so you're going to have an even greater surplus, and at the end of the race, you can make lots of magic happen when you can use all of the fuel that they don't have anymore. With all the mess of that car going off and all these people now jockeying for position, you can still save fuel as you're making moves on these guys, because it's really easy just to keep up your own pace as long as you can avoid contact with everyone else. My battle with this Audi had officially gone on long enough that I decided I was going to use a little bit more fuel than I would, especially considering the fact that I had a little bit of a surplus already, and that one decisive move of using a ton of fuel in that corner got me all the way ahead of him, and then he had to deal with that Ferrari. I was still close enough to the cars ahead that I can continue using my own fuel saving strategy and even get up close to them, so my fuel surplus was just going to continue building. It wasn't until the beginning of the next lap that I had an opportunity to make another move, and it was a pretty good opportunity right here. With these guys trying so much to get around one another, it left a really big hole on the inside, so I was able to get next to the Citroen, and then I made a pretty easy move on the inside. I did not expect that Ferrari to go across the grass and the other one to understeer, which then caused him to punt the other guy out of the way, and then things got pretty scary. Now, reading potential aggression is also really important because there's lots of it in Gran Turismo 7 lobbies. Volvo fanboy punted that other Ferrari because he hit him, so I knew that he would be doing the same thing to me, considering the fact the Citroen punted me into him, so I knew that if I passed him, I was probably going to become a victim. That wasn't going to stop me though. I didn't necessarily decide to pass him this way before I did it, but as I was mid-corner seeing that he was going to continue defending, I decided to just use a little bit of oversteer and completely clear my line. That made it so I could get all the way in front of him, and knowing he was going to punt me, especially considering the fact he wasn't going wide here, I just braked early. Like I knew was going to happen, he ran into me. He tried again, but we were able to get all the way past him, and then it wasn't an issue anymore. Like I said, I did brake early, and I did anticipate him hitting me like that. If you look at what was going on, with him that close to my tail going into the complete wrong line going into that last corner, and the fact that one person hit him once and he punted him all the way out the track, I think it's safe to assume he was going to hit me. I also only braked about 5 to 10 feet early, and he should have been able to see that, and he should have definitely not been following me in that line anyways, so I still feel pretty justified on it. The fact that neither of us took any damage and neither of us went off the track means that my conscience is pretty clear, but I know some people are going to disagree with the fact and say that I brake checked that guy. I think I did what I had to do. But I digress. We were now in 8th place, but 7th place was 7.3 seconds ahead, maybe 7.4. We had a little bit of a fuel surplus, but we had to use a little bit to get away from all of those people before. And so now we could actually safely use almost all of the revs without having to worry about running out of fuel before the end of the race. And if we were going to run out of fuel, we'd be able to tell a few laps in advance, considering how easy the math is to figure out how much fuel you need per lap, so I felt pretty good about just trying to chase down the fastest lap. Having spent the first 6 laps of the race being completely stuck in traffic, I was actually pretty far off pace, and it took me 2 laps to get down to a 53.8. I knew that I could do a 0.6, and Key had just hit a 53.6, so the hunt continued. This whole lap felt pretty good, and unfortunately, it wasn't quite enough. I got a 53.6, but it was a high 0.6, and so Key's low 0.6 still. I knew I was on a heater, but it just wasn't enough. I was still 0.005 of a second off the fastest lap, and with the people that I've been trying to chase coming closer and closer, I was pretty certain that even if I did have the pace in this final lap, it was just going to get stuffed because I was going to have to try to make a move on the guy ahead. I definitely hadn't given up yet, and I still had a fuel surplus, and looking at the splits, I definitely had the ability, I definitely had the optimal to do it, but I was getting closer and closer to the guys ahead. I already, in fact, had dirty air from that car ahead, so it looked like it wasn't going to happen. We persist, though. Even though it was Group 4, and Group 4 doesn't have really terrible dirty air when it comes to following people close, when you're through the twisties, it definitely still does count for something. You just don't have all of that aerodynamic grip that you would have, and so you're going to find yourself losing tenths unless you're really, really used to it and preparing ahead when it comes to setting yourself up for these corners and braking and accelerating and whatnot. I felt pretty good about putting approximately a second per lap on the guys that I had passed before, but of course all that battling made it so we couldn't do much, and despite that, we still made it up to 7th. I couldn't quite pull off the P-Steve, but 7th wasn't bad considering how the beginning of that race started. As you can see, the Ferrari is absolutely dominating, but there are lots of different options, so I hope you like the F-Type. I actually learned how to fuel save in the Group 4 F-Type, so there's a bit of nostalgia there for me, and I think it'll serve you well. Thank you as always for watching my video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you would like to do so, and I'm very happy to say that I've finished filming and recording my biggest project yet for YouTube. It's something I've been kind of talking about for a long time. I'm really excited to get to work on it, and I think you guys are going to like it. Stay tuned.